June 4th, 1943. A train platform in rural Texas. Unteroffizier Werner Burkhardt's hands trembled as he wrote words that could have earned him execution by his own officers. They must be lying. No nation at war could possess this. Through the train window, he was witnessing something impossible, something that violated 3 years of Nazi indoctrination, something that would destroy everything he believed about Germany's inevitable victory. Every farmhouse blazed with electric light, every street corner, every shop window, an endless constellation of electricity stretching across the Texas plains at 10 p.m. during total war. This single observation would trigger the most profound transformation in modern military history, not through torture, not through propaganda, but through something far more devastating to Nazi ideology: undeniable reality. You've been taught that wars are won through superior will, through racial purity, through military genius and tactical brilliance. But what 371,683 German prisoners of war discovered in America between 1943 and 1946 exposed a truth that Hitler's Reich could never acknowledge. Ideology collapses when confronted with overwhelming material evidence. These weren't just soldiers witnessing a foreign country. These were men raised on propaganda depicting America as weak, divided, controlled by Jews, incapable of sustained military effort. They had been promised that Germany's Aryan superiority would inevitably triumph over American mongrel decadence. Every single one of those promises was about to be systematically destroyed, not by Allied propaganda, not by torture or coercion, but by 3 years of living in the most successful re-education program in human history, one that succeeded precisely because it didn't rely on words. It relied on breakfast. The German POW experience in America wasn't about punishment, it was about revelation. These men had been fighting for a regime that promised them a 1,000-year empire built on conquest, racial hierarchy, and totalitarian control. They believed their enemies were weakened by democracy, corrupted by diversity, incapable of the discipline required for total war. Then they arrived in America and discovered something that shattered Nazi ideology more completely than any military defeat. A society so wealthy, so industrially powerful, so organizationally superior that it could feed its enemies better than Germany fed its own soldiers.
This wasn't propaganda. This was lunch. The transformation these prisoners underwent reveals a fundamental truth about human belief systems. People don't abandon ideologies because of arguments. They abandon them when reality makes the ideology obviously, undeniably, impossibly wrong. And America in 1943, operating at peak industrial capacity while fighting a two-front war, was reality at its most undeniable. Understanding what happened to these German POWs requires understanding how deeply their beliefs had been embedded. These weren't casual Nazi supporters. These were soldiers who had sworn personal oaths to Adolf Hitler, men who had been indoctrinated since childhood in the Hitler Youth, officers who had studied at military academies where Nazi racial theory was integrated into every subject, veterans who had witnessed German military victories across Europe and believed they were participating in history's greatest empire. Their belief system wasn't just political, it was existential. It explained the world. It gave meaning to suffering. It promised that German sacrifice would create a perfected society where Aryans ruled inferior races. This level of ideological commitment doesn't break through argument. It doesn't crack under interrogation. Traditional propaganda bounces off it like bullets off armor. but it dissolves when confronted with systematic evidence that every foundational assumption is wrong. The Nazi worldview rested on several core beliefs. Germans were racially superior. Therefore, German industrial and organizational capacity must exceed that of mongrel America. Democracy was weakness. Therefore, democratic societies couldn't maintain discipline during total war. Jewish influence corrupted America. Therefore, American industrial might was a facade that would collapse under pressure. German sacrifice proved German superiority. Therefore, Germans' hardships endured demonstrated strength rather than failure. Every single one of these beliefs would be methodically demolished, not through lectures, not through propaganda films, but through the accumulated weight of daily observations that made denial impossible. A man can ignore an argument, but he cannot ignore his breakfast when it contains more food than his family in Germany has seen in 3 months. He cannot ignore electric lights blazing across an entire continent when his hometown has been dark since 1940. He cannot ignore factories producing bombers every hour when German factories are being bombed into rubble.
When belief and reality conflict, humans experience mental stress. Usually, they rationalize away the conflict. But when the evidence becomes overwhelming, when every single day provides dozens of observations contradicting core beliefs, rationalization fails. And when rationalization fails, belief systems shatter. The demolition began before the POWs even reached America. The Liberty ships carrying them, vessels built in 4 days, crossed the Atlantic with German prisoners eating better than they had as soldiers fighting for the Reich. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann kept a detailed diary that would later astound historians. He wrote, "The sailors throw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk gone slightly sour. They dispose of more food waste daily than my entire company received weekly in Africa. This isn't mockery. This is genuine indifference to waste. Their supply appears limitless." Think about what this observation does to a belief system. These men had been told that America was economically weak, that the Depression had crippled American capacity, that democratic chaos prevented efficient organization. Yet here was a cargo vessel, one of 2,700 being built during the war, casually discarding food quantities that would have fed German civilians for weeks. If America could waste this much on a single transport ship, what did that imply about total productive capacity? But nothing prepared them for the lights. When the trains carrying POWs rolled through Virginia at night, every small town blazed with illumination. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, communities that in Germany would have been lucky to have a single electric street lamp, displayed illuminated shop windows, electric signs, houses with lights burning in multiple rooms. The trains passed factories running night shifts, their windows glowing, parking lots full even at midnight. Obergefreiter Werner Meyer, whose father was a Nazi party block leader in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered decades later, "We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Each one had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards told us this was normal, that every American town had electricity since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He just shrugged and said we would see." In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the Reich into darkness since 1940. Even before the war, rural electrification reached barely 20% of German farms. Yet here, in what Nazi propaganda had described as a decadent, collapsed America, electricity flowed like water. The train stopped at Roanoke, Virginia for water and coal. The prisoners watched as American railway workers performed in 30 minutes what would have taken 2 hours in Germany. Automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, mechanized lubrication systems.
Every aspect of the operation demonstrated technological superiority. More disturbing still was the casual wealth of the workers themselves. They wore leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and threw the empties into bins without thought. They smoked cigarettes continuously, stubbing them out half-finished. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer from Siemens before the war, calculated that the single railway yard they stopped in used more electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin used in a day. He wrote, "The waste was magnificent. They left lights burning in empty buildings, electric fans ran in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resource." As the trains crossed into Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners encountered American industrial power in full display. Through the windows, they watched endless factories, each one larger than anything most had seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched for 3 miles along the river, its electric furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, the train slowed as they passed the Rubbertown complex, where synthetic rubber plants had sprung from empty fields in just 18 months. 4 massive facilities, each employing thousands of workers, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany, despite inventing the process, had never managed more than 120,000 tons in its best year. Oberlieutenant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben before the war, understood the implications immediately. In a post-war interview, he recalled, "I knew those plants. I could see the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers. Each facility was more advanced than anything we had built, and there were 4 of them just in this one location. They told us there were dozens more across the country." The trains passed Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, visible from miles away. This single factory, built in just 9 months, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes.
At peak production, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from 1,550,000 parts manufactured by 1,500 subcontractors. The plant consumed 2.5 million square feet of floor space and used more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Hauptmann Werner Verli, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the window as they passed. He counted 17 B-24s in various stages of completion visible from the train. We had been told American planes were inferior, hastily built, would fall apart in combat, but I could see the precision of the assembly lines, the quality of the construction. These were not inferior aircraft. They were simply built faster than we could imagine possible. The deeper the trains penetrated into America, the more complete became the destruction of Nazi mythology. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge, while below them, barges carried more grain than the entire German harvest of 1942. The prisoners could see grain elevators stretching along both banks, each one holding enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote in his diary, "The Americans transport food as we transport ammunition, in endless quantities, without concern for loss. I watched them loading a single barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with meat thicker than our weekly ration." In Kansas City, the train stopped at a massive stockyard where tens of thousands of cattle waited for slaughter. The smell of meatpacking plants filled the air for miles. German POWs who had subsisted on 200 grams of meat per week in Africa, when lucky, watched American workers eating beef sandwiches during their lunch break. Gefreite Paul Fischer wrote, "They ate meat like we ate bread. No, that's wrong. They ate meat like we wished we could eat bread. The guard bought us hamburgers from a stand near the station. Meat, cheese, vegetables on white bread for 15 cents. He bought 20 of them without thinking, paid with a single dollar bill. This was not special. This was their normal food. The arrival at the camps themselves provided the next level of demolition. Camp Hearn, Texas, built in just 4 months, housed between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners in conditions that exceeded what most had known as civilians. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. Each building constructed with more lumber than entire German villages possessed. The camp hospital astounded the medical personnel among the prisoners. Oberst Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. X-ray machines, surgical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies that had been unavailable in Germany since 1941, all standard provision for enemy prisoners. He would later testify, "They had penicillin, this miracle drug that we had only heard rumors about. They used it freely, even on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying for want of basic sulfur drugs, and the Americans were giving us their most advanced medicine without hesitation." The camp kitchen became another classroom in American prosperity. Prisoners assigned to cooking duties discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas rangers that could prepare meals for 5,000 men. The daily ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, quantities that German civilians hadn't seen since 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, wrote, "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, simply excess. The American regulations require we prepare 10% more than needed to ensure every prisoner receives full rations. The surplus is discarded. I wept as I threw perfectly good bread into the garbage." By September 1943, the labor shortage in American agriculture led to the employment of POWs in fields and factories across the country. This decision, driven by necessity, would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any propaganda program could have achieved. Groups of prisoners were trucked daily to work sites, traveling through the American heartland without blindfolds or restricted routes. They saw everything: the endless fields of corn and wheat, the factories running 3 shifts, the shops full of goods, the parking lots full of cars, the houses with refrigerators and radios. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Unteroffizier Herbert Long watched a single machine process more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could have handled in a month using traditional methods. The gin was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943.
He recorded the farmer who owned the gin was nobody special, not aristocracy, not a party member, just a farmer. Yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including the Negroes, ate lunch from boxes containing more food than German workers received in a week, and this was normal. Every farm we passed was the same. In Nebraska, prisoners worked in sugar beet fields, witnessing agricultural mechanization that defied comprehension. A single combine harvester, they learned, could do the work of 100 men. The fields stretched to the horizon, each one larger than entire German counties. The farmers spoke casually of yields that would have been fantasy in Germany. 60 bushels of wheat per acre compared to Germany's 30 on the best land. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a farm outside Scottsbluff, wrote, "The farmer's son, a boy of 16,
drove a tractor worth more than everything my father had earned in his lifetime. When I mentioned this, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even a particularly good tractor. His father was waiting for a new model from John Deere that would be even better. The most devastating revelations came to those prisoners who worked near or in American factories. While Geneva Convention rules prohibited direct war production work, POWs could work in industries that freed American workers for military production. This technicality allowed thousands of German prisoners to witness American industrial capacity firsthand. At a Campbell Soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners watched production lines that processed more tomatoes in a single day than most German factories handled in a month. The facility operated with a skeleton crew of women and elderly men, as most young workers were in the military, yet production exceeded peacetime levels. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a German food processing plant before the war, documented the experience. Everything was automated: electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, steam cookers that processed hundreds of cans simultaneously. One elderly woman monitored controls that managed what would have required 50 workers in Germany. She did this while listening to a radio and drinking coffee. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power plant gained glimpses of the automotive industry's conversion to war production. The River Rouge complex, visible across the water, employed 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks.
The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, more than the entire city of Hamburg. Obergefreiter Franz Kellner wrote, "We could see the parking lots, thousands of cars belonging to workers. Workers! In Germany, even our officers rarely owned cars. Here, factory workers drove to work. The guard told us many workers owned 2 cars, one for work, one for family use. We thought he was mocking us." By winter 1943, the cumulative impact of these observations was producing what American intelligence officers called ideological collapse syndrome among the prisoners. The Special Projects Division, the secret re-education program run by the Provost Marshal General's office, documented increasing numbers of prisoners requesting access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Newland, a member of the monitoring team, reported in December 1943, "The prisoners no longer argue when shown production statistics. They have seen too much. The most fanatical Nazis have become quiet. They still maintain loyalty to Germany, but no longer speak of victory. Many openly question what they were told about America." The camp newspapers produced by prisoners themselves began reflecting this transformation. Der Ruf, The Call, published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually shifted from defiant nationalism to discussions of democracy, economic systems, and post-war reconstruction. Lieutenant Hermann Goetz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter that passed American censors, "We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, controlled by Jews, incapable of military prowess. Every day I am here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. We were told fairy tales by criminals." Christmas 1943 provided the most profound impact. American organizations, churches, and civic groups sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German POWs, enemies who had been trying to kill American soldiers months earlier. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. Local communities invited prisoners to Christmas dinners, though regulations prevented most from accepting. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the local Methodist church choir performed Christmas carols in German for the prisoners. Women from Hearn sent in homemade cookies and cakes. the Boy Scouts delivered handmade Christmas cards. This kindness toward enemies shattered the final remnants of Nazi racial theory. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Many have sons and husbands fighting against our armies, yet they show us Christian charity, not propaganda, but genuine kindness. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those absolutely certain of victory and secure in their power." The Christmas feast itself defied comprehension. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, ice cream. Quantities of food that Germany hadn't seen since before the First World War. The prisoners ate until they were sick, unable to comprehend such resources being lavished on enemies. Feldwebel Hans Bauer wrote, "We ate like kings, better than German generals eat, better than party leaders. And this was not special. The guards told us this was a normal American Christmas dinner, that every American family was eating the same meal. If they can feed prisoners this way, what must their own soldiers eat?" By early 1944, over 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in educational programs. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and sciences. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses. Stanford University sent professors to lecture on democracy and economics. The thirst for knowledge was insatiable. Prisoners who had been told Americans were cultureless barbarians discovered libraries with millions of books, universities that welcomed all social classes, scientific research that led the world. They read American newspapers freely, comparing multiple viewpoints, something impossible in Nazi Germany. Hauptmann Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later wrote, "American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without hatred. They spoke of science as universal, belonging to all humanity. They were years ahead of German research, and they shared knowledge with enemies. This generosity of spirit was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi ideology." The camp theaters showed American films, not propaganda, but regular Hollywood productions. Prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, seeing a depiction of American defeat and recovery that resonated with their own situation. They saw The Grapes of Wrath, amazed that Americans would show such self-criticism to enemies. Lieutenant Joseph Kramer wrote, "They hide nothing. They show their problems, their failures, their conflicts."
Yet this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such criticism would mean death. Here, it is considered patriotic. Spring 1944 brought expanded prisoner labor programs as American production reached its peak. German POWs worked in canneries, mills, and fabrication plants, witnessing the full might of American industrial capacity. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners unloaded steel that would become landing craft for D-Day. They watched as workers assembled 700 boats per month, each one requiring 20,000 parts. The factory employed 20,000 workers, including thousands of women who operated cranes, welded hulls, and managed production lines. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann wrote, "Women doing men's work, Negroes operating complex machinery, teenagers running drilling equipment. Everything we were told was impossible in a democracy. Yet production never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. They produced more boats in a month than our entire Navy built in a year." At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed the production of 10,000 tons of steel daily. The blast furnaces ran continuously, fed by endless trains of iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The scale defied German comprehension. Obergefreiter Paul Hartmann wrote, "This single plant produced more steel than the entire Ruhr at its peak. I worked at Krupp before the war. I thought I understood industrial production, but this was beyond imagination. They wasted more steel in spillage than we could produce with slave labor and double shifts. The workers complained about overtime while producing quantities we couldn't achieve with slave labor and double shifts." The summer 1944 harvest provided the final demolition of Nazi propaganda about American weakness. German prisoners worked across the Midwest, witnessing agricultural production that could feed the world. In Kansas, they watched wheat harvests where single farms produced more grain than entire German provinces. Combines moved across fields like ships across an ocean of gold, each one harvesting 100 acres a day. The grain elevators they filled could hold more wheat than Germany imported in an entire year. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, wrote, "One American farmer with machinery does the work of 100 German farmers." They showed me aerial photographs of the wheat fields, thousands of square miles of grain. They could lose half their harvest and still have more than all of Europe combined.
In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards that stretched beyond the horizon. They watched as perfectly good fruit was discarded for minor blemishes, fruit that would have been treasured in Germany. Entire crops were sometimes plowed under to maintain prices, a concept that caused psychological breakdown among prisoners from hunger-ravaged Germany. Gefreiter Otto Schultz wrote, "They destroyed food to keep prices stable. Mountains of oranges bulldozed into pits because they had too many. We begged to be allowed to send them to Germany, to our families. The guards were sympathetic, but explained it was impossible. The waste was strategic proof of unlimited resources." June 6, 1944. When news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps, German prisoners experienced their final ideological collapse. The scale of the operation, 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave. It demonstrated American organizational capacity beyond Nazi Germany's wildest dreams. Prisoners at Camp Shelby watched newsreels of the invasion within days. They saw the endless streams of ships, the artificial harbors, the supply system that delivered 15,000 tons daily across open beaches. They watched their homeland being crushed by the very nation they had been told was too weak to fight. Oberst Friedrich von Tauben wrote, "We knew then that everything was lost, not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial mythology. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, courage against their unlimited resources." Throughout their captivity, German prisoners experienced something that challenged Nazi ideology more than any material wealth: American humanity. Despite propaganda depicting Americans as weak and sentimental, POWs discovered a people secure enough in their strength to show mercy. When Gefreiter Hans Miller's son died in the Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife wrote that she was struggling to feed their children, American church groups sent food packages to her in Germany, enemy civilians in a nation America was actively bombing. Hauptmann Otto wrote, "They separated the German people from the Nazi regime. They said they were fighting Hitler, not Germans. This distinction, which seemed like propaganda, proved genuine.
They prepared us to rebuild Germany after the war, not to destroy it."
The medical treatment particularly affected prisoners. German doctors worked alongside American medical staff, learning new techniques, using advanced equipment. Prisoners received operations that would have been available only to the elite in Germany. Mental health treatment, virtually unknown in the Wehrmacht, was provided to traumatized soldiers. Dr. Friedrich Bauer wrote, "They treated attempted suicides with counseling, not punishment. Prisoners with mental breakdowns received therapy, not beatings. This humanity toward enemies revealed a strength we never understood, the confidence of true power." By March 1945, the secret re-education program had produced remarkable results. Over 25,000 prisoners had volunteered for democracy courses. The camp newspapers published articles about constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Discussion groups debated Germany's future after the war. The program's success exceeded all expectations. Prisoners who had arrived as fanatical Nazis were writing essays about democratic reconstruction. Officers who had sworn oaths to Hitler were planning how to implement American agricultural methods in post-war Germany. Oberst Hermann Göring, no relation to the Reich Marshal, admitted in a 1975 interview, "We became missionaries for democracy, not through coercion or propaganda, but through observation. We saw it work. We saw ordinary people living better than German aristocracy. We wanted that for Germany." April 1945 brought the final revelation. As American forces liberated concentration camps in Germany, the footage was shown to German POWs. Many refused to believe it initially, claiming it was propaganda, but the evidence was overwhelming. Testimony from American soldiers, photographs, newsreels, and eventually letters from Germany confirming the horror. The impact was devastating. Men who had maintained some pride in German honor, despite military defeat, now faced the complete moral collapse of their nation. Everything they had fought for was not just defeated, but evil. Hauptmann Walter Schmidt wrote the most eloquent summary. "We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. We found that we were the barbarians. The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what civilization actually meant." As the war ended in May 1945, German POWs faced repatriation with mixed emotions.
They had witnessed an America that contradicted everything they had believed. They had eaten better as prisoners than as soldiers. They had been treated with more dignity by enemies than by their own government. The last months of captivity were spent preparing for return to a destroyed Germany. American authorities provided vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction. Prisoners learned about the Marshall Plan before it was announced, understanding that America would rebuild rather than punish Germany. Oberst Friedrich von Tauben wrote, "They prepared us to rebuild our country. They gave us skills, knowledge, hope. They transformed defeated soldiers into future citizens. This generosity from victors was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi vindictiveness." Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German POWs were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a Germany divided, destroyed, and destitute. But they brought with them something precious, knowledge of how a democratic industrial society functioned. The German POWs who experienced American prosperity became unwitting agents of transformation in post-war Germany. They had seen industrial efficiency, agricultural productivity, and democratic prosperity. They knew reconstruction was possible because they had witnessed a society that had achieved it. Many former POWs rose to prominence in West Germany's reconstruction. Hans Kroll, prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught classes at Camp Como, became president of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Weckmar, held at Camp Herne, served as German permanent representative to the United Nations. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, and American democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built partly on knowledge gained in American prison camps. Hans Kroll wrote in his memoirs, "We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest. We saw that democracy created wealth, that diversity brought strength, that treating workers well increased production. These lessons, learned as prisoners, shaped the new Germany." Historians have called the German POW experience in America one of the most successful re-education programs in history. Without coercion, without propaganda in the traditional sense, American industrial might and democracy converted hardened Nazis into future democratic citizens.
The program succeeded because it relied not on words but on observation. Prisoners saw American society functioning at peak efficiency while treating enemies with dignity. They witnessed industrial capacity that made German production look primitive. They experienced a standard of living that exposed Nazi promises as fantasies. Dr. Arnold Kramer, the leading historian of German POWs in America, concluded, "America won the propaganda war not through clever messages, but through sheer reality. Every full meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The POWs were converted by prosperity." The statistics support this assessment. Of the 371,683 German POWs held in America, fewer than 1% attempted escape. Only 2,222 total attempts recorded. Post-war surveys showed that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Most remarkably, thousands maintained correspondence with American families for decades after the war. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, surviving German POWs held a reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former prisoners returned to America, many bringing their families to show them where their transformation had begun. Former Obergefreiter Hans Weber, who had been held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later returned to become a physician in Georgetown, Maine, spoke at the reunion. Life in the camps was a vast improvement for many of us who had grown up in cold water flats in Germany. We discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food. But more than that, we discovered dignity. Former Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Meyer, who had worked on farms in Iowa, added, "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared their meals, their knowledge, sometimes their homes. This humanity from people whose sons were fighting against us, this changed us forever." At the 1985 reunion dinner, former Oberst Hermann Goetz, then 78 years old, delivered the keynote address that captured the essence of the transformation. "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from production, not from hatred, but from diversity, not from tyranny, but from freedom. We witnessed the arsenal of democracy at full production."
We saw farmers who produced food for the world, workers who built the tools of victory, and citizens who treated enemies with dignity. We learned that America's true weapon was not its bombs or tanks, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and its unshakable confidence. We returned to Germany with a mission:
to build a society that could create rather than destroy, that could prosper through peace rather than war. The Germany that rose from the ashes was built on lessons learned in American prison camps. We who came as conquerors left as students. To America, from your former enemies, now your friends, thank you for showing us the way. The auditorium erupted in standing ovations. Americans and Germans together, former enemies united in recognition of a transformation that had seemed impossible when those first trains rolled into Texas in June 1943. The story of German POWs in America is ultimately a story of redemption through revelation. It proves that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through destruction, but through demonstration, not through propaganda, but through prosperity, not through hatred, but through humanity. The German soldiers who witnessed American industrial might became unwitting ambassadors of democracy, carrying back to their homeland the seeds of transformation that would bloom into one of history's most successful reconstructions. Their journey from Nazi warriors to democratic citizens remains one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history, accomplished not through force, but through the overwhelming evidence of what free people could achieve when they worked together. In the end, that was America's secret weapon. Not just the ability to produce more tanks and planes than any nation in history, but the capacity to transform enemies into friends through the simple power of example. The German POWs were stunned by America's industrial might, but more importantly, they were changed by it. And in that change lay the foundation for a better world.